Perfect.
Okay, so the UN was, as a bit of context, created at the end of the Second World War in 1945. And the reason for that was at the end of the First World War, the international community got together and said, well, the royal families of Europe failed to stop that war and failed to stop it quickly once it had started. So many of those royal families disappeared at the end of the First World War, and the International Committee created the League of Nations. And the League of Nations was there to maintain world peace through, very simplistically, diplomacy, policy, and arms reduction. And that at best only had, I think, 58 members, of which many of the largest countries in the world, like the US, were never members. And so the League of Nations then failed to avert the Second World War. So the international community came together again, having lived through 2 world wars now, and said, okay, so the thing that was missing from the League of Nations was a call to humanity's interaction with culture. And they saw that culture was a critical element of keeping peace. What they, at the time, in a way, failed to identify was that while culture can contribute to keeping communities peaceful, healthy, sustainable, and stable, what it can also do is be a reason for a conflict, a weapon in conflict, and a target in conflict. But we'll come to that in a moment. So the UN was created in 1945, and as a special element of that, it's a new agency was created, UNESCO. And UNESCO, as an agency of the UN, was there to essentially deliver peace through education, science, and culture. And that was the agenda. So you have the first line of the UNESCO constitution: since it is in minds of men that wars are created, it must be in the minds of men that the defenses of peace are established, or very similar to that. Mm-hmm. But the UN was created, understandably, by the international community as a political organization. And its structure was based on nations and based around a Security Council of 5 key countries. And those were the 5 major powers in 1945. So the UK, the US, France, China, and Russia. And those countries were given what was called a veto over any activity that the UN wanted to do. And that has been the Achilles heel of the whole UN system ever since, because the UK and US go off and do things that Russia and China don't like, and so Russia and China veto those activities, and Russia and China want to do things, and the UK and US veto those, and France on occasion. So you have this inbuilt failure system, in a way, within the UN, and it's extremely difficult to work out how to deal with that without dismantling the whole of the current UN system. But in a way, that inbuilt veto almost completely stops the UN being modified. Mm-hmm. Even if 4 of the permanent members of the Security Council wanted to do something, one of them could veto it. Mm-hmm. And as far as I understand, even if the UN General Assembly of all of the countries of the UN wanted to do something, a permanent member of the Security Council could veto that action.
Yeah.
And so there you have a mandate for the UN to develop world peace. You have a specialized agency of the UN dedicated to that, but you then have this fundamental flaw within the system that you have the veto. And that's the same everywhere on the planet. And as I say, there are things that, Russia and China want to do that are vetoed by the Western members. There are things that the Western members want to do that are vetoed by Russia and China. And, not least, you have the problem that in, for example, Ukraine, the Russian Federation is seen to be an aggressor by most of the rest of the UN system. Well, no, that's unfair. By most of the rest of the Western democracies. There are a lot of countries in Africa and elsewhere in the world that don't see the Russian invasion as being as difficult, problematic, dangerous as Western countries do. And they see a lot of Western countries being intensely hypocritical when they have taken action without UN permission, such as the US and UK-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. So what we see in the Western media and through Western politicians is a very specific view on a conflict like the one going on in Ukraine. So that's where you're stuck. In terms of what's going on in the Middle East, you have a similar problem because Israel is supported by the US, and the US will block things, usually in cohesion with the UK, that is deemed to be against Israel's best interest. So you have to some extent, impasse within the whole system. So the Jerusalem Post is very vocal in that the UN is a failed international organization that should be disbanded and replaced. But what they would replace it with, they, to my knowledge, have never actually put forward. So it becomes a sort of ongoing problem and a circular issue that you want to, I think everybody would be open to some level of reformulation of the UN system, apart possibly from those 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. But the mechanism isn't there because the 5 permanent members are there. Now, it may be, and I mean, I'm no lawyer, and I'm certainly not an international lawyer, but I've had conversations with people who are, and there is an argument that says the UN, it might be possible for the General Assembly to essentially gang up on the permanent 5 and say, either we reform the UN or we will all leave the UN and create something else. But that's an untested hypothesis. So I don't know, does that answer much of what you were asking?
Yeah. And then, so regarding wartime preservation, right? What does that look like on the UN side, and how, if you had to rank like how successful it is, how successful would you say that the UN is in doing that? Of course, you were talking about there's difficulties, right, getting things done.
So I mean, the UN has passed a series of Security Council resolutions over the last decade, which support a raft of international humanitarian and international criminal law that prohibit the specific deliberate destruction of your enemy's cultural property.
Mhm.
So the most important one of those is the first one of those, the 1954 Hague Convention,
Mhm.
and its two protocols. Now that's an internal, effectively, UN convention, because it's the convention that was facilitated by UNESCO. It is still facilitated by UNESCO, even though the convention belongs to the now 134 high contracting parties to the convention. So every other year there is a meeting of those high contracting parties in Paris, where all of those can go, and the activities of the committee established under the second protocol, the Committee for the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflict, essentially reports to the high contracting parties, and they have the ability to influence the next 2 years' work. But that's about as far as it goes in terms of the UN system. So it's there is an international legal instrument, the Hague Convention, but it has never been properly used to prosecute anybody for misdemeanors under the convention.
Mhm.
And one of the main reasons for that is because very few countries, if any, have fully and properly implemented all of the articles of the convention.
Mhm.
So the only two I would say that come fairly close to implementation are the Swiss, because the Swiss always do,
Mhm.
and South Korea, or the Republic of Korea, because it sits with an aggressor country with which it is still formally at war, with North Korea just above it. So those two prepare because there is a clear and present and immediate threat. Or no, I'm sorry, the South Korean one does. The Swiss, as I say, just because the Swiss,
Yeah.
excuse me, if they ratify something, they tend to go with it and do it properly.
Mhm.
Almost nobody else has fully implemented the convention. The US has not ratified either of the protocols, and for reasons that we don't have to go into here, I would be surprised if they ever do. The UK has ratified everything, but still hasn't implemented the convention fully. And as just one example of that, when we were going through the process preparing to ratify, the Ministry of Defence went through the process of establishing under Article 7 of the Convention a specialised military unit that had an understanding and capability in relation to cultural property protection. And that was set up in, I think, 2018. It may become active in 19, with up to 19 specialised officers with skills relating to cultural property. It is with a fairly high-ranking lieutenant colonel or equivalent head of the unit, and that was a tri-unit Army, Navy, and Air Force unit. It is just about to become a unit without a senior officer, and from 19 maximum officers, all reserve officers, down to probably 6, and an Army-only unit. So even though in 2017-18 there was a great momentum, that momentum for a whole raft of different reasons, but has nevertheless, not only stopped, but it has shrunk the unit and the breadth of the unit and the capability of the unit, therefore. And I mean, very simplistically, for a unit staffed entirely by reserve officers, you estimate that only a third of those officers are going to be available for active service at any one time, which means the unit is down effectively to 2 people. And so it's that sort of thing. So, but it's not only the Hague Convention. The Geneva Conventions of the 1940s, 49, had additional protocols added in 1977. And there are 2 aspects of those additional protocols for international armed conflict and armed conflict not of an international nature. And they both bind into the Geneva Conventions all of the articles of the Hague Convention. And then finally, most importantly, the last one, although there's some other areas that you can pick up on, most importantly is the Rome Statute, which is the international treaty signed in 1998 that created the International Criminal Court. And again, the International Criminal Court, the Rome Statute has clauses in which relate back to the whole of the Hague Convention. So it's there, and the Rome Statute and the International Criminal Court, with the giveaway of the name of the court, is international criminal law, not international humanitarian law, whereas both the Geneva Conventions and the Hague Convention are international humanitarian law, or what the army call laws of armed conflict. So it's there, but it's not being implemented properly, because nobody wants to believe they're ever going to have a war, or they're going to be a target in a war, and that they are going to be in a position to damage other people's cultural property. So it becomes an issue of prioritization. In the UK, we don't think we're going to get invaded anytime soon, or even if not invaded, attacked by ballistic missiles. Or indeed by terrorism, particularly. But all of those are possible, and yet we do nothing in our disaster management plans about armed conflict, and very little, although an increasing amount, especially with the national museums, about terrorism. So it's something that nobody wants to think about. And it was the same with Ukraine. And in fact, Afghanistan just before then, that the government said, we are not going to pack up the National Museum because we don't want to worry the population that we are going to be having a conflict. So we are going to keep everything, nice, everything's going to stay on display, etc. And then suddenly it's too late. And because there is no peacetime implementation, all of the processes and the partnerships that should be developed in peacetime that would enable a country to rapidly react to a conflict situation by putting in plans and processes that have been organized and worked out long beforehand, they're not there, and so they can't do it. So people start trying to make stuff up on the move.
Well, yeah. Thank you. That's very informative, and that's exactly what I needed to know.